Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense. Online at pressupinc.com. You've written about how you get the sense of a place, of a neighborhood, of a city by going to that city, going on Grindr, seeing who's around. What does that tell you about a city? What can you infer about a city from the men of Grindr that you see?
You know, we're told not to judge a cover by its book. Sorry, so
That way's hard to do too.
All right, let's start again. We're often told to not judge a book by its cover, but we actually can infer a lot about people through a quick glance. And when you turn on Grindr in various neighborhoods, you get a feel for whether the people consider themselves artsy or do they consider themselves businesslike. If you get a slew of faceless torsos that are very, very built up, that tells you a little bit about the neighborhood you're in, about the competition between the men to be that certain look. If you're by a university or a college, then you get a different kind of mix. And so it's quite telling because you look at things like class, race, how we put ourselves together. And when you have a lot of people on one screen, you actually can tell quite a bit.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Toronto, Canada, here outside the village, above the Glad Day Bookshop, speaking with Jaime Woo, who is many things: a writer, a game designer, a festival director, co-founder of the upcoming Gamercamp celebration of video games here in Toronto, and the author of Meet Grindr, How One App Changed the Way We Connect, a book about the app we're talking about. And if you turned on Grindr right here in this place, what kind of a social profile would it turn up about this area of Toronto?
You would get a really diverse mix because we are very close to the gayborhood, to the gay village. And so you would see definitely a lot of people who openly identify as queer and who also chose to live in a neighborhood where that was central to them. We are also close to Yorkville, which is the more Tony, kind of expensive area. And so you may see some people who might shield their identity but are looking for some fun. We're in a central transit area, so really you may also see a lot of commuters who are potentially taking advantage of the nice day and walking to their next stop. And so we're actually in a great location right now because you can get so many different types of men in one area.
This is a case in point. You write in the book how Grindr is thought of as just a hookup app, just, somebody who wants sex right now, quickly. This is how they find it. But it's not just for that. You can use it other ways. You can use it to gauge a neighborhood. You can use it to, what else? What are some creative ways to use Grindr that aren't just the stereotype?
I think that finding men is the foremost reason for it. But to think that that's all the app is for is unimaginative. I have used it to sometimes just start conversations in foreign cities with people that I don't know, but I may just be feeling a bit estranged because I'm in a new city, and you can talk to people, and I've had conversations about politics and about television and culture. You find someone else who loves Golden Girls or loves watching Roseanne, and it's funny because you still have this flirtatious tenor to your conversation, but you realize that it doesn't have to all be a slew of dick pics that are coming at you.
Yes. It can be that. It doesn't have to be that.
It can be a mix of that, absolutely. I think I've used it to just ask people what they're up to or what they do. I'm just curious about people. Of course, I've also used it to meet men. Someone delivered me coffee once using the app. And so I think that it's important to see that the primary interaction is sexual, but that it can be so much more than that. You really have all these people who are around you, and it's up to you to try to find the kind of conversation that you want on it.
It's interesting because really the way that we talk about Grindr, we could be talking about a city itself. Like it's a collection of people all around you right there. Why do a lot of people move to a city? Often because they're looking for a partner. I mean, if you grow up in a small town, for example, and you're not of a conventional sexuality, where do you want to go? A city. Because that's, where you find people who are, if not exactly like you, then at least understand you a bit better or on the same page as you. So what is it about the way that, this is a good illustration of the fact that the internet-related technologies, smartphone technologies, that kind of connectivity. For a while there, we were saying, with all this stuff, we can live wherever we want. It doesn't matter. We can live on a mountain. Now we can do everything over the internet. It's not important to live in a certain place. But it seems like this is an illustration of the fact that, kind of, but it also, it enriches living. It enriches living in cities even more, having this. Like, it's less important to be in the city, sure, but also more important. And the Grindr illustrates one aspect of that, right?
Yeah, because I totally agree with what you're saying, because Grindr does depend on density. So there are some places where people will be 30, 40 kilometers away on the app. And
it shows you the 100 closest men, right?
Yes, because it shows you the 100 closest men. And sometimes that's not a problem if people are driving, then it's not really that far a distance. But I think what's magical about it is the density and the novelty of it, that if we walk down the street and reboot it, we'll see different men. And I think that even with all the progress that we see socially, it's still something amazing to be able to know that around you, you are surrounded by people who are like you. Another thing that I find really interesting is that people often flatten the argument around Grindr. They assume that everyone is on it for just one thing. Sure. But I've noticed that as queer culture becomes more progressive and more open, we don't have the same signifiers that we used to do. When I was growing up, you knew that you had to know something about Judy Garland or all about Eve, or there are all these code words, and we've kind of lost that because really we're no longer defined so narrowly by that code. And I find that a lot of young men are just on there to chat because they're trying to discover what commonalities they can have. And they're trying to discover, they know that the biggest commonality is that they all want to have sex with men. Right. What else is there? Yes. And
it's got to be something more than that, right?
Right. At some point that can get quite monotonous. And so I find that often there is a curiosity, a mental curiosity about who else is out there and how are they like me.
How often have you used this to figure out a new city when you're going someplace? Just talking, just asking questions about the city or asking questions of the people who pop up who are there. I mean, are there places you've used this and it's really it has really put you in the right frame of mind to understand a place? Can you do that on Grindr?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing this. Grindr came out in 2009, and I got it in June. It came out in March, and I got it in June. And since then, I've always opened it in whatever city I go to. And every city has its own characteristics. It's different in San Francisco than it is in LA, than it is in Boston or New York. It's different in different parts of New York. So to me, I can learn a lot about what kind of structure and culture those men have built for themselves. And granted, it's just a snapshot. You can't say that having seen maybe 2 places in Brooklyn, that all of a sudden you have an idea of it.
Yeah, better than nothing, though.
But that's exactly it. And I can learn things about age. If you go to LA, then definitely there is a lot more discussion of age and looks than you might imagine other places. San Francisco tends to want the interactions to be rougher. And even though we think of San Francisco as very multicultural, I was actually surprised to see that there was still some segregation between the queer men and their interactions. So those are the insights that I draw from it, that other people just aren't looking at. And I wish they would, because it's a really interesting conversation.
That word multicultural, I mean, it's one you just applied to your ideas about San Francisco, but it's one that's been applied to Toronto here for decades and decades now. What does it mean to you when someone says Toronto is multicultural?
In the 1990s, Toronto really embraced the fact that we have a very diverse population. It's always been on the lead in terms of having a minority majority, that the majority of people here are visible minorities. And growing up here, it was something I was fiercely proud of, because too often people of color don't see themselves reflected in the world around them. And certainly in Toronto, I can look around and I'm shocked if I happen to not see people of color, because it's just so rare. At the same time, as I get older, my idea of multiculturalism has become more nuanced. I think that you can have people all in the same city and yet not necessarily embrace all the benefits that come from that. And so we could partly see that with the mayoral race this year. Obviously, everyone probably has heard of Rob Ford.
Yes, of course. If they know one thing about Toronto, they know who Rob Ford is.
Yeah, it's the thing that now every time that I go to a different city, if I mention Toronto, people are like, that Rob Ford. At least it's a conversation starter. But he had his perspective was quite damaging around people of color. He once referred to Chinese people. He used to say, those Orientals, they're gonna take over because they work so hard. They're like dogs. And it frustrated and shocked people here, because we don't want to think of ourselves as having these views when we're multicultural. But at the same time, it helped me to see how you can have multiculturalism, but not necessarily equality and fairness.
Because of a mayor who represents what exactly, or represents who?
This is such a you're gonna get a real Cole's Notes of, or I don't know what the American equivalent of that is.
Cliff's Notes.
Cliff's Notes of Toronto history. This city amalgamated about a decade and a bit ago, and we were 5 different municipalities that became one. And what happened was that there was a downtown, and then there's a ring of inner suburbs. And it's not to say that people in the inner suburbs share not the same views as downtown, but I think that there was a frustration that a lot of attention is constantly put on Toronto. And what our mayor tapped into was the kind of open speak that I think people normally don't see in politicians. So even if the message he said wasn't fantastic, I think people what resonated with them was his apparent honesty and his anger about the way the system worked.
At least he's straight shooting, plain spoken, I don't know.
Right, exactly. But to go back to my point then, in this election, we have Olivia Chow, who is a woman of color, and she's done a lot in Toronto for decades. And should she become mayor, she would be the mayor of the 4th largest city in North America. And we don't see a lot of women of color rise to that level. And yet there's been no discourse around it in this city. And while I love Toronto for its multiculturalism, I think we're all very proud of it, we sometimes use that as a shield from having a real discussion of whether or not everything is equal and fair here.
Now, you say you grew up here? Were you born here?
Yeah, I was born in East York, which is one of the municipalities that got merged into Toronto. And then I grew up in a suburb north of here before returning for schooling.
Now, what if, Arthur C. Clarke said that every sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what would your 13-year-old self have said if he'd known about Grindr? Like if you'd said, this thing is going to exist in the future, would it seem like magic?
It felt like magic when I saw it in my late 20s. Because the ability to conjure up a screen full of men and have access to start conversations with them and to even know that they're around. I always say that Grindr is like having a superpower,
Right.
that you get to see through all of the walls and all of the buildings and often through people's clothes to see all the people around you. And also you get to communicate with them without anyone else knowing. It is magic. For my 13-year-old self, it would have been fantastic to be in the suburbs and see that there were other queer-identified men there. I don't know if I would have wanted to be using Grindr at 13. It probably would.
It'd be scary, but you'd like to know that it exists. It's fascinating that it works as intended. It's fascinating just to see that conceptually it's a real thing that took off in a big way.
And to know that you aren't alone. It's very easy to build lives for yourselves that can become quite isolated from seeing the diversity of men out there. And that's been the other thing that I really like. The apps have started moving towards filtering men, and I think that that's a negative because we should see all the different types of men that are out there. I love local spaces. I love the village because you're forced to break out of the narrow band of images that we constantly see. They aren't all the same size or the same shade of color or the same height or this or that. And that's beautiful. We should find beauty in more places.
That's an interesting thing about Grindr because, as you write, its advantages in a lot of ways come from its limitations. You can't do a lot of things on Grindr. You can't be too specific about what you're looking for. You can just see really the men closest to you in a specified age range, and that's it. And from that limitation, which can seem pretty stark compared to other, shall we say, dating apps, that limitation is an advantage, right?
I think that the core ethos of the app was that you should use it to find someone and then meet as quickly as possible so you don't build up those expectations that can occur when we go online. It's very easy for anyone who's done online dating to volley back and forth in conversation for 3 to 4 weeks, let's say, and build up this expectation, this idealized version of the person you're going to meet. And of course, they can never match that.
Right, yes. It's doomed in that way from the start. If you've had this elaborately crafted profile and there's been this long-term interaction, there's no way for that to really pay off in the way that because it's so specific. Your ideas have grown so specific, right? In Grindr, the idea seems to be, even when interacting, to keep things as general as possible or on, how to put it, as undetailed a level as possible almost.
Yeah, I mean, there's always an element of fantasy that comes into when you're meeting people. There's something that you have to romanticize to become sexually attracted to someone, but to try to keep that constrained. And also, I think, to just allow for chemistry. I think that we have to allow the digital to augment the I don't want to say real life, but the meat space, as they say. And I think that is sometimes when people talk to me after having read the book, that's one of the insights that they get, that they kind of used Grindr too much as a crutch. They tried to get every piece of information that they could. And you really can't do that. It'd be like having met someone at a bar and asking them 900 different questions before you go home with them. Sometimes there's an inherent risk, not even in terms of physical safety, but just in terms of chemistry or matching. For any new partnership, we have to accept that rather than hoping that technology will mediate it to a point of safety.
Right. It's an illustration of one of those ideas that wasn't so correct about, like in science fiction a long time ago, well, not even a long time ago, 10, 20 years ago, writers would imagine us all constantly immersed in this virtual world or some version of Second Life. We'd always be completely on the internet. Really, what the apps and such we use most often are ones that, as you say, augment they're augmentations to our existing life, wherever we happen to be. They're not replacements for it. Grindr is nothing without the meet space, without real life, right?
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes, there will be people who use it and try to trim off as much of that human nature to it, right? It's literally just a sexual transaction and they're done. Right. I think that's fair as part of the spectrum. I just worry when we reduce it to only that.
Right. On one end of the spectrum, of course, you have the Grindr users who are voyeurs only, digital voyeurs only. They don't want to meet anybody, and they'll lead people on as far as it needs to go for their satisfaction, right?
Yeah, and I think what's difficult for a lot of people, as we all try to understand how this technology integrates with our life, is that different people have different uses for the apps. That's been the main thing that I've been trying to push with the book and just, with the writing that I do, is that we're fooling ourselves if we think everyone's going to be doing stuff the same way, right? Some people go to a bar to just be around people. Some people go to drink in public. Some people go to meet friends. For us to assume that we have just a mono use for things ends up frustrating us because we're setting the wrong expectations.
Well, it's the same way with building a city in a sense. Whenever someone in power has an idea for what a city should be like, here is the use for the city, or you think of famous city remodelers like Robert Moses or Le Corbusier. They sort of, this is what a city is for, this specific thing, and let's rebuild the city so that people can do this one thing, maybe drive between towers or something like that. But the interesting experiences come from structures, digital or real, that can be used in any way people want, yes?
Yeah, I think that there was recently an interview with Fran Lebowitz, and she was saying that New York has become a tourist city and how dull it is because once something becomes just for tourists, there's really no realness behind it. There's no mixed uses to everything because you're just
one use, tourism.
That's exactly it. And I think that we lose out a lot once we try to do that. I think a lot about the ideas of contact and networking. And this is Samuel Delaney from Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, where he talks about how networking are those direct functions that you have in a city towards your career or life, those things that you purposefully build. And yet contact are those random moments of human connection that just happen from having a lot of people in one space. And more, I miss and I want that contact because it's too easy, especially with technology, to reinforce and be in a bubble of our own views. I don't want to talk to other upwardly mobile creatives in their 30s who are from cities. I'm bored. I barely want to hear what I have to say. Sure. I want to hear from other people.
Yes.
And that's part of being an adult, I think, is understanding that you're coexisting with lots of other people and trying to find those other views to expand your worldview. Otherwise, even if you feel like you're right, you're coming from a very limited place.
Right, it's one of those dangers, especially of internet use, because the internet enables us to find exactly what we're looking for, and often the most successful operations on the internet are the ones where you can dial it down to the most specific thing you could ever possibly want, which is cool in the moment, but people realize it seems often too late. Whoops, life feels really boring now because I've narrowed it down to what I thought I wanted. And this is, I don't know if Grindr was designed with avoiding that in mind, but you've met the creator. I don't know. Is this an artifact of the way of Grindr's simplicity, or is there some intent like let's counteract this impulse to want one very specific kind of man, or whatever it is on the internet. Let's see what other pathways there are to find what you want, what you don't know you want. Do you think there was any intent like that behind Grindr?
I don't think so. And I think that that's okay that it wasn't there. I think it was built expressly to help men get to each other faster. Right. But I think that, if we look at how Twitter evolved, very often the users can diversify and complexify the space they're in. And that's what I hope people are doing with Grindr. Essentially, it is just to bring men together as quickly as possible, right. But that shouldn't stop us from using it just for that. I think that I have friends who now use it as a messaging service because you can just favorite people nearby and you can find out where they are. And we've decided that our communication doesn't have to be strictly through just telephone or text message. We feel just as comfortable. You know, I'll get a friend who writes me through Google Hangouts. Right. Then will write me on Facebook. Then will find me somewhere else. And we just kind of be in each other's spaces as we are.
Interesting. So you have individual friends who communicate with you across platforms. For me, it's always like there's some friends that it's always through Facebook for some reason. Some friends that's always through an email. Some that are always through Twitter more rarely. But it tends to like break down. There's certain channels through which different real life friends, I always communicate with them through, maybe because that's just how it got established and we continue on that pathway, but you use multiple platforms for individual friends.
Yeah, as long as you're in my face, I can see you and I can communicate with you, I will. I want to quickly go back, though, to the idea of what happens when we drill things down to just one use, because it really reminded me of the example of Uber. And Uber, when I first used it, it was fantastic because I was in San Francisco outside of the core and I couldn't find, I wasn't really that far outside, but I still couldn't find a taxi. And it was, again, like magic to be able to just pull up a car and have it ferry me back into where my hotel was. But I think a lot now about how when we are so direct in our transportation methods, how we lose out on being able to just see what's around us. Right. I actually love taking the bus when I'm in other cities because I want to see who takes the bus and who doesn't. You're not going to be able to meet anyone or talk to anyone or get any insight to anyone riding in an Uber.
That's true. Even the driver? Do they not know anything?
Well, we kind of talk about the same things. Do you like Uber? How is it? You know, like, you know, how has it been going? Okay, the people are a little bit more polite sometimes.
It's not a good cross-section of a city to talk to an Uber driver, in other words.
No, and so now I use it for if I'm running late, that's pretty much it. I use it as a fantastic essential service, but I try not to rely on it because I really missed having that ability to slow down. I love walking through a city because then you can stop, you can look at something, you can restart. Whereas if you're in an Uber and you see something fantastic, you're not going to ask the driver to turn around and to go back and look at it. And so lately I worry a lot about people losing those ephemeral moments around them to this idea of efficiency.
It's this idea of looking at a city by seeing who's riding transit, for example. It's something I do as well. And before recording, you mentioned getting a sense of Toronto by looking at the ads, looking at who's in the ads, looking at the diversity of people on the ads. What should one or I or whomever watch out for when like looking at an ad in Toronto?
So growing up, we talked a little bit about the multiculturalism in Toronto, and I have always been very proud of the fact that in our media and in our marketing, multiculturalism and diversity have been reflected. And so you look at banks, which are often the most conservative businesses, and they will have a cast of very multicultural cast in their commercials. It is not rare to be outside of the downtown core and see a banking ad with a mixed race gay couple. Those are things that I discovered were very, very rare outside of Toronto.
So you grew up with all this around you and it was normal. What was the moment you discovered that wasn't worldwide?
As I did more and more trips to the States or to Europe, and I looked at these images because as a tourist, we can learn so much from the advertising that is around us. And to see how monochromatic it was very shocking to me because I guess having been born and raised here, I'm used to looking for the people of color. When I'm in other cities, that's who I'm looking for. I'm trying to see who else looks different from the majority. And so to look at the ads, it's very shocking to me that most of the ads feature white people. And then if they feature people of color, it's very rarely mixed. Right. You've got, okay, this is the ad with the entirely black family, and this is the ad with the entirely white family, and here are, it's just kind of segregated that way. And you know this came down from some demographic study.
Oh, yes, it's funny. I mean, you say that that's definitely true when you go to the States. The ads get a little more demographically bland. But I think about my own circle, and almost everybody I know is in some kind of interracial relationship, myself included. So, it almost isn't reflective of reality even in the other countries you go to. Like, you probably see more interracial couples, more gay couples going around in these places than you see in the ads. Like, the ads aren't reflecting the actual population. Might not be as diverse as Toronto. Few cities are, but there's that disconnect. It's kind of weird that there is that disconnect where it's not actually looking like the people you see, right?
And that's been that is a funny thing. Whenever I go to a major city, I always pick up the gay magazine or the gay advertising. And I look to see who's featured, and it's always white bodies that I see. And there's two truths behind that. One is that, unfortunately, that is still what sells. It must be that white bodies like to see white bodies, and they're willing to spend on that. And they are still kind of considered the ideal beauty standard. The second, though, is that people aren't looking at the world around them. There's something different between doing a study and actually just looking around them. And in my book, I talk about the fact that mixed-race couples are booming in the States, and actually queer-identified couples are growing the fastest. And we rarely see this reflected in queer media, or not nearly as much as we should. And so there are complicated issues around race on Grindr and in the queer spaces. But we have to also look at those silver linings because they are important.
Right. Why do you think that in Toronto, a bank ad can reflect the true population? Is it just because this idea of multiculturalism has been so strong for a long time? Or why here are advertisers smarter about keeping up with the trends, if that makes sense?
I think that the fact that we've had multiculturalism for longer makes it more acceptable, and it's something that we're fiercely proud of. And Torontonians, because they're so proud of it, it's not contentious. We don't have overt contention around race in this city. It's not. We also don't have the same deep history that the States has around race, which I think makes a big difference. And Canada, having had English, French, and American influences in its origins, has really had to contend with being a land where there are very different ideas of identity.
Right. And from day one, from the get-go, they had to deal with that. So there's been time to get used to it.
Exactly. And I think that we haven't. I think that it's also had an incrementalism that's been very useful. I think a lot of times race is not obviously just an issue by itself. It always is mixed with ideas of class and gender and all these other things. But there hasn't been very many incidences in Toronto where it sparks up in a way that I think created a pushback.
It's one of the things I read about Toronto, that writers who are from outside of Canada or just outside of Toronto coming here would sometimes get frustrated by what they saw as the city's lack of a sort of singular direction, or maybe the city didn't seem to have a specific goal or vision for itself. But that you say earlier about the apps and such, or the things we use that don't narrow us down to just one goal. It seems like Toronto, if that goallessness exists, it's an advantage, probably more so than a disadvantage. It seems that way to me. There don't seem to be ideas that have Toronto in their grip, if that makes sense. Like, Toronto is one of the more, from what I gather, I haven't experienced the city much yet myself, but from what I gather, it's one of those cities where there is a freedom in its not lack of coherence, but there's not much unifying it, is there?
I think that the way that you describe it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of small cities that are woven together into Toronto. And if I was to describe Toronto, it would be polite but distant.
I see.
And so we are very polite, and this is why we can have better multiculturalism. You know, again, I'm going to qualify that by saying that we still have issues with race here, and definitely a couple of decades ago, you know, race was much more contentious than it is now. I don't want to whitewash our history and say that it's always been perfect. Right. But it's what has allowed queer rights to blossom here. It's what's allowed a lot of different acceptances to happen because everyone's very polite but distant. Well, that's great. I'm happy for you. You're over there. I'm over here. Sure. I don't actively want to not do something with you, but I also accept that you're there. And it's a very interesting thing to realize coming to Toronto, or, you know, being born and raised in Toronto, that is the way that everything works. It's a weird internal check and balance. Nothing can be too trendy in Toronto because we have that distance to prevent us from being too trendy. So, for example, food trucks are very, very hot, and they may be over in other cities, but we have so much red tape around food trucks that there's still a special treat. We get them once in a while, but it never got to become an overblown trend here because you just couldn't get it to happen. And so that kind of small c conservatism, the fact that what happens here stays here for a long time, that's one of the benefits, but also one of the challenges of being in Toronto.
Given the multiculturalism, you'd think this could be one of the better food truck towns, like Los Angeles is, you know, with so many traditions colliding, culinary and otherwise. You'd think this would be a good ground for it. But when you do see a food truck on those rare occasions, how good are they?
They're pretty good. I think that unfortunately what we don't have is the investment behind it so that they can be stellar. Or that, you know, we can have anyone who wants to have a food truck to get one. So we have all of the fantastic things that a great city should have. But we're very careful not to have the misses, but it also means that sometimes you don't have the really solid home runs too.
Right. There's not those ends of the top and bottom ends. You sort of cut those off.
Right, and that's why I say Toronto's a very livable city. If you happen to know some people here, it's fantastic because they'll bring you to all their favorite haunts, and you feel like you really you don't necessarily feel like a tourist. You can really feel like you live here because you'll be treated like you live here. But it's definitely not a New York where you're like, here are the 7 grand things that you need to see. Yes. And I think a lot of Torontonians are happy that we don't have that kind of grandness because it creates expectations that we don't really want.
Growing up in a suburban area, I mean, were you looking to Toronto, looking to the core of the city as a goal, as the place you ultimately had to be?
To be honest, no. When I was younger, it was at the time where, okay, so this is a bit of a tangent. Feel free to edit it all out if it's terrible. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is that we live in an era where all of our past works of art can now be accessible to us. So when I was growing up as a kid, if you missed an episode of a show, you'd go crazy because they'd move on the next week and you'd hope that they either rerun it or it'd play in the summer and you have to go back and figure out how that fit into your understanding of the story. But now on Netflix, you can get a whole history of TV shows, and you can also go on YouTube, and many of them have just been uploaded and are there to watch. And so when I was growing up, I was very content in my suburban home because I had access to all these fantastic independent films. I could order all the great literary works I wanted to. It's not to say that that's a replacement for the city, but I never fetishized the city that way because I was able to surround myself with really creative works. Now being in the city, it's really funny because you spend your day-to-day working and trying to pay for living in the city, that you don't always end up doing all the quote-unquote city things that you hope for. So a lot of nights are still spent watching Netflix and, well, now drinking wine. But, to me, my city life was not, I don't see that demarcation as strongly.
You write in the book you frame Grindr for a chapter of the book as a kind of video game. First of all, what place have video games had in your life?
Video games were a fantastic escape for me. I think that also probably is why I didn't need to feel like I need to escape anywhere else. Right. I was so in love with what these works could do because they were whimsical and playful, and I still hold those things to me, right? There's that saying that I think it's Ursula Le Guin who says, the creative adult is the child who survived. And for me, video games still embody that playfulness, that whimsy.
What are some of the games you have the best memories of from growing up?
So I especially loved role-playing games, which are your typical kind of steampunk fantasy with dragons and spells and all that stuff. But when I was a teen or younger, that was amazing. It just had so much agency and so much ability to do things that as a kid you don't always have. And it brought in, there's this specific game, and I know this is getting super nerdy now, but there's a game called Final Fantasy IV, and I'm going to spoil it. There's a scene where two of your characters actually sacrifice themselves and turn themselves into pillars of stone to protect the rest of the characters. And for me, at a young age, that was my first introduction to death and sacrifice and working toward the greater good. I think that it wasn't just a hero fantasy to save the world that was important to me. It was really understanding the things that we have to do for that greater good. And I could explore a lot of interesting things through video games that I'm so grateful that that time was there.
And I mentioned that Gamercamp is coming up this year. What happens at Gamercamp? Why did you start Gamercamp?
So we started Gamercamp as a way to allow people who are passionate about video games to congregate and to find new games and to be around other people who loved games as well. I'm always jealous of my film friends because they have this vernacular to be able to discuss film, and they are so excited about film and in all its different ways. How you can talk about cinematography, you can talk about special effects or screenwriting, and we haven't broken games down in that way yet. And so an appreciation for games still is quite surface level, and we want to change that. And so what we do is we have a pop-up arcade. We book this boutique hotel in downtown Toronto, and we fill it with games on all the floors. Wow. Including inside the hotel rooms. Because to me, there's always been a fatal flaw when you attend a video game event, which is they're always put in these kiosks, and there's always 20 of them in a row, and they all blare at the same time. And I can't imagine trying to experience a work that way. It would be like going to a film festival and they just have everything showing at once. Be like, enjoy, pick up the headphones, just stand and watch it. Oh my God, yes. And so we actually put the games inside the room so people can have that sense of intimacy.
What range of games are you putting up in this hotel? Is it all eras of game? Is it new stuff? What's going in there?
So we try to expose our attendees to interesting new creative works. And so when we first started, we did tread on nostalgia and going back to the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. But now, there's so many fantastic independent works coming out that we wanted to get people to think about it, and to also break out their idea of what a game can be. So this year we've got just really weird, whimsical games. There's one that's projected on a tent, and you're inside, and there's a quilt that they've sewn buttons in so you can interact with the quilt to change the game in the tent.
It's like the old NES power pad you put on the ground. I remember that thing. You're supposed to run on it, but people always use their fists. This sounds like a more interesting version of that.
Yeah, and people are starting to play around with different form of media, which I think is vital. Another group created a game that brings you to like the 1990s action film. One person has the Oculus virtual reality headset, and they can see a bomb, and they have to speak to their team members who cannot see it about how to defuse it. So it's just, yeah, it's just like in a movie. Oh, I got the red wire and the yellow wire. What are you going to cut? That to me is so fun. I think that we kind of, in games, as it tried to be taken seriously, it kind of lost some of that whimsy, and I hope that our event brings it back.
What sense do you have of the Toronto gaming community? I mean, is that something you can gauge from doing Gamercamp, or does it bring people from all over the place, and so you don't really get a sense of the Toronto gamer from it?
I think I can definitely speak in terms of the creator side of it. Toronto was left out when big studios, the AAAs, landed in Canada. So they went to Vancouver and they went to Montreal.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's like Electronic Arts over there and all that stuff. I forgot about that.
That's right. And Toronto was kind of left behind. But what it meant was a lot of people pulled up their bootstraps and said, if I want to do this, I got to do this on my own. And it's been really interesting because that happened at the same time when Toronto is a great space for art and culture. It's a great living space. And so you have these people who can survive and have multiple influences who are creating these independent games. And it was so good that actually attracted Ubisoft to open up a studio here. And so I think that it's very optimistic here, and it's very earnest and ambitious. And the people who come, I think that they're a bit starved for this. We try to really cater to a wide range of people in different ages. And I think it's easy for me to see how video games have only really targeted one segment.
Right, again, the narrowing down. They found the gamer and sold to who they thought was the gamer for a long time. And there's a lot of people in this world you could sell video games to, more so than the sort of 17-year-old dude, right?
Exactly. And living in this multicultural city, I was surprised that our attendees weren't always as reflective as the multiculturalism around. And that's been one thing that I've just been trying to change with presenting works that disrupt the idea of what games should be. Last year we presented a game that there were bowls of water and they had a conductivity through them. And as on the screen there was falling fish, and you had to tap the bowl with your hand to actually catch the fish. And it's kind of like Dance Dance Revolution. But to me, you can't buy this game. And yet it's an experience I know people talked about again and again. And I think that was important to me, that we can't just commoditize games, that games we've been playing for thousands of years. We have to find different ways to do it that don't end up just behind a corporate black box.
Right, yes. It reminds me of, I wasn't alive for the earliest days of video games, but when there were first video games, a person couldn't just buy a video game, and it was such a novelty, like you've got to experience this wild thing that is a video game. It takes you back to that, right? It makes the concept of a video game alien again in a way.
Yeah, and when I was a kid, I wanted to make video games, but I had no idea how they were done. You can go to Universal Studios in Florida and learn about filmmaking a little bit, but we really didn't have anything analogous for games. And to me, that is a shame, that we make people feel like they're not technically or artistically sophisticated enough to make these things. And so that's also been a major driver for me. I know that a few weeks back you had a discussion with someone about maker culture.
Yeah, right, Mark Frauenfelder. Yeah, we talked a little bit about that, sort of specifically the way when I was a kid, I remember, finding certain game-making tools and always abandoning my projects, but now they've got incredibly advanced. It's like, wow, where was this when I was 9?
Well, and also to be able to take the strengths in your life and turn that into a game, I think that's a very vital skill. I made a physical game, so there's no digital component to it, and it's a mix between Operation and Twister. And the reason I made it was because I wanted to play with the idea of social distance. So in it, people try to surround rival team members without touching them. Most games require you to touch someone to complete the action. Mine is to not touch them and hope that they bump into you. And what I wanted to do was to put people who were strangers into extremely close proximity. And I wondered whether or not that would make them feel closer.
So it's a social experiment in some ways.
Yeah, I never advertised it as a social experiment because that might scare people. But I thought about the fact that you smile because you're happy. But they also say that if you smile, then you can cause happiness, that it is a two-way street. And so I thought normally when we're with people that we don't know, we keep a social distance from them. What if I created a game where part of the objective is to get as close to them as possible, overcome that social stigma? Do they become closer after? And very often people end up laughing and they feel so much more comfortable with one another after the game's been played. And games are great that way, that they can be a reason to break some of those social stigmas.
Right. It is a little bit like Twister in that way. Once you've done that, you're like, well, I guess we know each other now. But how did you know you could make a physical game, I guess? So if there's one sense in which making a video game, it's like, well, there's so much technical stuff I have to do. It's pretty hard. Making a physical game, there's almost a conceptual boundary to get past. Like, can you make those? You know what I mean? How did you figure out how did it occur to you to do that?
There is a artist in the city named David Fono, and he was really big in introducing physical games to Toronto. And at the same time, actually, there's Indiecade, which is a Los Angeles games festival. And I played a game called Ninja there, which was also a physical game. And seeing adults play these types of games inspired me to try to make one myself. I didn't know that I could make it, and I'm still surprised that I was able to make it. But I think that we intuitively know how to make games more than we think. Right? We always make little games up anyways, right? Oh, who's going to be able to clean up faster? I'll race you to here or there. And just like with other art forms, we get dissuaded from it because that's what people do in the adult world. They tell us that we can't do things because we're not professionals. Stop singing. What do you think? You're on The Voice?
Yes.
And you're like,
do your homework.
Right. It's like, let me sing terribly. Just go away. And so that was I was like, let me make a terrible game. And at the end of the day, no one has to see it if they don't like it. Right. I've been very lucky. The game isn't terrible and people really enjoy it.
Right.
But
usually it's the first step, just to make something terrible.
Yes. I'm really worried now because that was my first game. And normally your first game
is going to drop.
Yeah. So my second game is going to be horrible.
Get it out of the way as soon as possible. It's an interesting way you framed games in the book. Just as experiences with rules, right? Or rules that create an experience. I guess sets of rules that create an experience. Is that a good working definition of games?
Yeah, I think that definitions are only helpful if they allow us to have some clarity, but don't restrain us so much that they constrict creativity. So to me, a game is just an experience bounded by rules is good enough. Yes, you can find outliers, or you could push it to, all right, so I'm cleaning the toilet, but if I clean the toilet within 45 seconds, is that a game? Sure. It's a terrible game, but it's a game.
Much of a game.
Yeah, it's not much.
Right. You need to keep the definition of games broad. That's where interesting games come about. If you say, well, a game, I play it on a console and a guy walks to the right and I jump. I make the guy jump occasionally and shoot things. Sure, there's a lot of games like that. We all know. But it's, again, another example of the two limiting. Now, Grindr, what makes Grindr like a game? Is it the fact that there are rules?
Yes, it's that the behaviors are bounded by a set of rules. I should also add, games are only games when they are entered voluntarily.
Right.
So, like Saw, the movie, that's not a game. Those people did not enter. So Jigsaw was actually incorrect when he says, let's play a game. You got to be voluntarily there for it to be a game.
What about the Hunger Games? Do they enter that I don't really know. I've never read that book, but are the kids in the game voluntarily, or are they not?
I don't think so.
Why would they be?
Yeah. So with Grindr, it's the fact that there are only certain ways to interact with one another. And how you interact does change the experience. And to me, I I suddenly saw the connection when I was actually at the game developer conference in San Francisco. I turned on my Grindr because I wanted to see if there were any other queer identified game makers there. And while I was closing it and opening up, I forget what game I had at the time. I think it was a puzzle game. I was like, these two are not that different.
Right. Close one, open another. Same deal.
Right. I'm still trying to work through this system. And that's where I discovered things like, everyone knows the same script to use on Grindr. And why is that? It's because we've realized that there are certain ways to work through this system to get the optimum benefit.
It's like everybody knows the checkers moves you should do. Everybody knows how to start a conversation and keep it going on Grindr when they've played a little bit. I imagine you encounter the first timers who clearly, you've never played this game before.
Exactly. And so, people, when they're like, hi, how are you? How's your day? How's it going? You're like, you've never used this app before, have you? That's not how we talk.
Yes, those aren't the rules of that's within the rules of Grindr, but it's not within the rules of strategy. Like there's the subset, there's the rules you can't break because it's part of the system, but then there's the rules that develop by playing it, the rules you stay bounded in because it is the strategy of Grindr, right? So strategy is rules in some sense.
Yeah, so you can subvert some of the tropes that happen on Grindr. And it is knowing what those rules are that you can know which ones to bend or which ones to change a little bit. A strategy that I love is that I see a whole slew of men who are all 28. Because if you're 29, you're probably really 30, and 30 is for some reason a death age.
Right.
It was such an outdated idea.
I turned 30 in November. I'm waiting for the end of life.
Well, that's it. You should just close the blinds and never go out again because
it's over.
Yeah, it's over. But those were the little things that I noticed. That there are little tricks that people use to boost their chances of meeting with people. And of course, I should bring up that our vernacular, our language around sex and love is very game based. If you hook up with someone, we say you've scored.
Sure.
Right? If you're very good at getting someone, getting dates or whatnot, you've got game.
Right. We had a popular book 10 or so years ago called The Game, all about picking up women quickly. It was just called that, The Game. And from what I understand, it's about that, for guys who wanted to frame it that way, they could understand. It was almost like they could understand women better if it was in terms of a video game, picking them up, which doesn't speak very well to guys generally. But, that psychology clicks with people. The gamification is a word now, I guess, because of Silicon Valley, but people get into gamification, don't they?
Yeah, to me, I think it's more important to look at systems design, because that's what I actually come from an engineering background. That's why I studied. And to me, that's why I'm always interested in the structures and the cultures around us, because I want to know how they're built. To me, that's how I looked at Grindr as how is the system built? And with that design, how do people work within it? And that was something that I hoped readers would find illuminating, that they just assume we often forget that technology mediates our behaviors and our interactions. We just assume that everyone on Grindr will act the same way that they act in a bar, but how things are designed influence the way that we interact. And so I dislike the term gamification because I think it's a simplification.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really likes it. I would almost cringe saying it.
Yeah, very often it's pointsification. Like, I'll give you 25 points to do this, and I'll give you 72 points for that.
Great, 72 points.
Right. And so that's always the running joke, that we just, we give each other points for nothing because that's what's supposed to drive it. An incentive, but a really well-built system that has its own drivers. And to me, I'm always fascinated when people get it right.
Now, what are some other strategies you've used or you think people could use to explore the systems that are cities like Toronto? What strategies work well to get to come to understand? How do you understand what the rules of Toronto are? That's what I wonder.
Oh, you don't actively think about these things, but now that you ask the question, I've got examples. So knowing the way that First of all, sometimes people joke that our national languages in Canada are English, French, and passive aggressiveness.
Sure.
Especially in Toronto. And learning that polite but distant thing that I mentioned earlier really will help you better survive Toronto. That sometimes people will be passive aggressive because they don't want to be labeled as rude.
Right.
But they still want to make their point. And so they kind of waver. And that's why sometimes I enjoy being in New York, where people will just tell you to get off the street. And you're like, all right, thank you for being blatant with me.
Yes.
So for instance, people, a gay bar example. In Toronto, if you're at a gay bar, what will happen is that you arrive, let's say at 10 p.m. You will see lots of men around you. You may see attractive men that you're interested in. You may exchange glances, but nothing will happen. Don't try to go up to them because they will turn you down or pretend they weren't looking at you. Don't look too much because you don't want to look too desperate. And what happens is between 10 to midnight, everyone has about 3 or 4 beers. And once midnight hits, it's a free-for-all because everyone can say, oh, I'm drunk enough and it's late enough. And you provide excuses for your behavior. So you can go out on a limb and talk to that cutie who's across the way. And if he says no, who cares? And if you go home with him and it's a disaster, you have an excuse for it.
That's the rule. Once you cross that point, then almost the rules change after midnight.
That's it. There's that kind of worry about what other people are going to think about you until we collectively say, oh, this is okay now. So I don't tend to drink very much when I'm out because it's expensive in Toronto. But I found that after midnight, you act a bit drunk, and it makes it easier for people to talk to you because if you're too sober, people have no interest because if you get shot down, they know you were sober when you shot them down.
Yes. As insidious as on Grindr as anywhere, if you know the rules well, you can use them to your advantage then, right?
Exactly. So, but conversely, when I'm in New York, people just come up to me. I've had people be like, you're gorgeous. I love you. And it just scares the crap out of me.
How do you even, there's no way to have that be non-scary, I think. I don't know what is the way to handle that?
I don't know. I just said thank you and left. But yeah, different cities have different rules. And so for me, that's been part of learning to be here. We have an incremental system here because we don't want to rock the boat too much. People talk about the tall poppy syndrome here in Toronto and in Canada. You don't want to shoot too high because people will cut you down the second that you grow too tall. So everyone will support each other until you become too big for your britches, and then everyone turns on you.
You have to leave Toronto.
And then you have to leave Toronto, or what you do is you go to another city, you become big, right? You become Jim Carrey, and you leave for the States, you become big. You become like the founder of Monocle. You make a huge magazine, you come back, and all of a sudden, Tyler Brûlé. All of a sudden, you're an icon then because you've succeeded elsewhere. Right. You've bypassed that rule in Canada that says that you can't grow too tall.
That's the rule.
That's the rule. You were allowed to grow tall.
Tyler Brûlé knew it.
Yes, you were allowed to grow tall in the UK or in the US, and then you came back. So that's different than if you tried to grow too tall here on your own.
These are the kind of rules you need to learn here to survive in Toronto, the city I've been speaking with my guest today, Jaime Woo, in, specifically just outside the village above the Glad Day Bookshop. Jaime is a game designer, he's a festival director, he's a writer, author of Meet Grindr, and he's got Gamercamp coming. When specifically is it?
It's October 17 to 19, and I welcome anyone. You don't have to be a gamer to come, as long as you're interested in games. Even if you just play Candy Crush and you find it so fun and you want to find something else like that, it's for everyone.
Well, Jaime, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. This was fantastic.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Treher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.